explore and share some ideas on value innovation and invite you to interact, ask questions throughout the session, because I think it'll be more meaningful as we're going to be exploring some kind of questions on the frontier. We talk a lot about value in Agile, and we know that Agile is about generating, creating, and delivering high customer value, but rarely do we ever actually spend the time to quantify value and think about value and value innovation as giving us a competitive edge. So we're going to introduce some new ideas today and kind of invite you to explore with some questions, especially in terms of how you might be able to apply and use some of these concepts. So our biggest challenge, I think it's safe to assume that all of us in this room kind of share the common challenge that we have far more to do than we have the capacity to do it, and are constantly faced with the challenges of trying to identify the highest value work, not only in terms of our product managers and our product owners who are trusting to prioritize their stories for us by value, but even as Rebecca was saying, the really cool thing about Agile, one of the beauties of Agile, is the amount of code we don't do, or the amount of work that we don't do. You know, in the service of creating that innovative competitive edge to find the space for innovation and actually optimize our value delivery chain. So our biggest really challenge is no longer the reach of our imagination in terms of what we should do, but it's what we can do, but it's really what we should do in terms of optimizing that value to our customers and doing so in a way that's actually sustainable, you know, and creates the space for really innovative value generation. Does that make sense? Cool. So what we're going to be talking about kind of falls under the category of challenging us to all think of ways of how we can actually do less. You know, we've probably all heard the expressions or maybe be under the constraints of managers who are always challenging us to do more with less. Does that sound familiar? We've all heard that, right? You know, what the result of that is really, it doesn't really make any more sense. We've already delivered those kind of process improvements that enable us to actually do more with less. And when we're trying any more to do more with less, you know, it puts us into this vicious cycle of not creating the slack time to actually do less. So I often invite my teams, you know, at the beginning of a team startup or a team kind of working agreement, to find ways to challenge each other to actually do less. You know, eliminate that do more with less, to actually find out how we can do less. And in focusing on doing less, and actually paying attention to what we do, as well as paying attention to what we don't do, you know, create the space for innovation to occur and actually generating more value. Kudos to Declan, who took me up on the offer question.
Pat, would you mind just taking one step to the right?
Oh, I am sorry. You're seeing my silhouette as opposed to, well, thank you, Declan. I appreciate that. Thank you for that. I was trying to accommodate the camera as well, but thank you very much, Declan. So does this make sense? In other words, we're going to be spending the next hour or so challenging how we might want to quantify the value on the stories and the work that we deliver, and find ways for us to actually do less and achieve more. Some of the other phrases that we use to kind of represent this opportunity is creating speed to value or reducing the cost of value. They all kind of fall into the same category, which is now becoming increasingly popular, which is considered kind of under the umbrella of value innovation. And Walt and I teach this course at the university at the UC Berkeley as well. So it starts with having the courage to actually face reality as it is, and not what we wish or what we would like it to be. Oftentimes, we get so into the trap of just doing that we don't always take the time to step back and actually challenge what it is we're doing in terms of the question, which would be show me the value. So it's another thing I like to encourage teams to do, and that is really challenge each other and challenge me. Kind of create an organization that's focused on creating a language of value and then creating a currency of value so that we can begin to quantify value. We've all also heard the message that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So finding a way to actually create a currency of value and a culture of value that rewards that measuring currency of value by facing the reality of where we work and where are those value traps, or where are those opportunities to actually find more value. Second step would be making the complex clear, finding a way to actually take on the challenge of measuring value. Probably most likely all of us work in organizations where we track story points, or story effort points on our stories. Is that most of us? Anybody have work in an organization where you actually also track value points on your story cards? Imagine if you do. Cool. Chime in, by the way, throughout this discussion if there are things that you would like to share in terms of how you derive, how the team estimates value, or how your product owners quantify value. Because when you look about how you're going to measure value, we're going to start to talk about how we're going to quantify value. There's always two sides to value. One is cost, and one is the true business value that you're delivering. And the true business value that you deliver, which gives you the opportunity to actually prioritize and focus on value, is really the business value point, if you will, just like story points, divided by the effort points or the cost points or the story points to create a value index that you can then normalize across your portfolio to be able to truly measure and manage value and to make value-informed decisions about what to do and what not to do, how you actually create an environment or an opportunity to do less. By attending to and taking the effort of making the complex clear, or finding ways to actually measure value and assign value at the release level, or at the capability level, or at the functionality level, and look at the value that's delivered to the business relative to the cost, time, risk, and effort it takes to deliver that value, is where you're actually going to be able to create a space for value innovation to occur and start to create a culture, where you can make value-informed decisions and when you can actually encourage people to challenge the value of all of the work that's being done in terms of the value outcome or the value output. Does that make sense? In the earlier sessions today, we kind of talked a lot about the fact that Rebecca even kind of challenged us to recognize that one of the beauties of Agile is in the amount of work we don't do. In its essence, Agile allows us to actually create a space to do less and to do more of the higher value first. And some numbers here we'd like to kind of share with you, very reputable numbers. Many of you may have heard of the the Standish Reports and the Chaos Chronicles, and a lot of research work that's been done. Most of the features that we deliver in our software do not actually recognize or generate the planned value. Does that ring a bell? In fact, if I were to ask you to guess, just within your own experience level or within your own organizations, what percentage, if you will, of the features that your teams are delivering actually really recognize or deliver to the customer the planned benefit that supported the actual feature development effort? Anybody want to hazard a guess or kind of share at your organization what you think that might be? Any ideas? Well, generally, in the research that's been done, 64% and upwards of 64% of the features that we deliver do not actually deliver the true planned value. Is there anybody who actually measures, through A/B testing or through some other output customer focus groups, the value that you deliver in terms of your features that are delivered? Anybody experience that? In other words, you do have...
No, I just had a question.
Oh, yes, please.
I was wondering what you mean by planned value.
Excellent. Oftentimes our product owners and our business analysts do a lot of rigorous work in terms of defining the business case or doing what I often call opportunity assessment or opportunity analysis. So that might look like, depending on your organization or what it is that you actually do in terms of creating value, that might look like customer research, customer focus groups. That might look like estimating the return on investment, where you expect increased customer sales or increased dominance in the market or moving into new market areas. Those would all be perceived as planned value, right? Does it make sense? Like working at an e-commerce company most recently, the planned value that we would have often look at is what is this feature going to deliver for us in terms of recognized revenue or improved cash flow? Oftentimes it's decreasing expense, or decreasing customer returns, by improving the product fit or fit reviews. Does that make sense? So the language that I'm using in terms of planned value represent that business case that was developed up front in terms of the opportunity analysis that actually justified the opportunity for us to do the project in the first place. New product, creating new product, moving into new markets, penetrating into other competitive markets, those would all be perceived as planned value. So with that clarification, do any of you work at organizations that actually test the effectiveness of what you've delivered in terms of real recognized benefits after, to learn from that planned benefit analysis? Does it ring a bell? Or does anybody do it? Right? Ultimately, the unit of value that gives us the greatest opportunity to generate more value is our ability to learn. And just as we always find ways to improve our estimating ability in terms of our estimates of effort, to really create or look at the value life cycle, we would always want to learn from what we planned the benefits realization to be to what it actually was in terms of continuously through generating and storing those heuristics so that we could then get better and better at identifying what the next greatest value opportunity might be. In the spirit of actually doing less, creating a value life cycle, just like we have a software development life cycle, to enable us to do that. And that would include, so basically the research that's been done out there talks to us about 64% or more of the work that we actually do generating the value that we planned. I oftentimes also use a metaphor to sort of kind of anchor this thought, and that would be on the remote control devices that we all use on a daily basis with our TVs. If you think about your remote control device, there's probably 3 or 4 buttons on that remote control device that actually deliver most of the value to us. But imagine the development efforts and costs and all the technical debt that would be incurred with features that don't actually deliver the planned value, that create what Rebecca had talked about in her session, that create that drag on our opportunity to generate even more value, right? Does that make sense? Because imagine we all pride ourselves on the effort of actually generating code that would deliver the highest value with the least number of lines of code or the least code complexity. The same would be true for the spirit of delivering business value. But it's unclear, very rarely do we find ways to actually measure, quantify value, and really measure value. And so in order for us to make very clear, informed, value-based decisions And because we don't have that measure or the currency of value, it's hard for us to communicate value. And it's hard for us to know when to make those decisions. So the hardest work that we face is actually figuring out what to do, in a world of infinite possibilities and complexities. And very much like Rebecca was talking about the difficulties of depending on a crystal ball to influence us, we oftentimes put the burden on our business analysts or our product owners or our product managers of just quantifying the value or prioritizing the value for us. So how do we know what's most important to do? How do we even know within our own organizations where we're creating waste versus where we're creating value? And how do we know when we're done? What I found in my experience, a lot of times the real challenges of value are at what we call the tails of a project. Starting up the project and having a lot of waste associated up front, not having all the right people in the room or all the right environments set up, and having everything ready to really kind of hit the ground running and starting up projects, but also at the tail end of the project. You've all probably been on projects where you simply keep going until your budget runs out. If you don't know if you've delivered sufficient value to actually wrap the project early and reinvest your time and energy into generating something of even higher value to the company, then the waste usually comes in at those tails. Does that resonate? Does that make sense? Most everybody's on projects and you either exceed the budget or you actually just keep right on going until the budget is exhausted. That's at least been my experience. Any comments or questions, or does that resonate with folks? Also, every opportunity that we have to create value is an equal opportunity to create waste. And when you think about time, in respect to value and in respect to value creating opportunities, everything we do uses a portion not only of our own time, which is challenged and limited, but also of our team's time as well, in terms of exponentially leveraging that time to create value or possibly to create waste. Creating less clutter, making sense of it faster, and actually finding a way to measure value and quantify value gives us an opportunity to actually leverage time to our advantage by doing less and doing especially less of the marginal value work or the complicated code complexity or complicated architectural solutions. So basically, to recognize that we create our own time poverty and we create our own opportunity to either deliver more value or to deliver more waste. So what do we need to know? How do we get clarity? Where do we begin to start getting clarity on how we measure value? And how do we actually set ourselves up to succeed with this? Shane's going to be walking us through some specific tools that he would like to introduce us to in the next session on how to actually reverse this direction and actually create more opportunity for generating value. But Walt and I are going to talk you through an approach that we find very successful in terms of starting with value clarity, working within your organizations, each of you individually, to really focus on what's of highest importance to your organization right now, in terms of what is the need for your focus on customer value, and creating a model, a logical model or a physical model of quantifying what are your top priorities for the year or for the next, next quarter. Of generating optimal customer value based on what your working knowledge of customer value is in the moment. Does that make sense? And always having that value model prominent, pay close attention to it. The work here is kind of formed out of the genesis of 5 years of amazing research that the Intel engineers put forward to developing and quantifying the value that their IT organization delivered to the business. By doing this work and putting some of their best and brightest engineers on defining how IT creates value for Intel, they were actually able to differentiate themselves in terms of gaining far more, quantifying how they generate value for their customers. They did a lot of work, and we can make this work available for you in terms of white papers and generating algorithms to quantify value in a consistent way that it could be normalized across the portfolio. They took on some challenges such as how do you actually measure the value of usability? Or how do you actually measure the value of some things that just seem to be too complex to measure? By quantifying that, and by actually normalizing that into algorithms, they were able to start to tackle the challenge of finding a consistent measure or currency across the organization to measure value in terms of value points. So you can use a value model, you can use these value dials to quantify value and measure that across your program, your feature set, your set of capabilities, or your stories, to look at cost, to look at risk, and to look at effort relative to the value that you're expecting to deliver on this particular set of features or in this particular release. And then make value-informed decisions on making trade-offs. When you're faced with new priorities that might be coming in continuously to create even more value for the organization, or making those kill decisions of when a project has delivered more value, as much value, where it's now hitting diminishing returns. Does that make sense? We all track, we're familiar and comfortable with tracking burn-up charts or burn-down charts, but once you actually start to measure and quantify value, you can overlay those burn-down charts with value charts and find that, competitive edge of where you're actually going to want to kill the project or move a remaining backlog of stories into maintenance mode, because the project has delivered the optimal combination of value at the lowest possible cost. So what you can see in the bottom corner here on value innovation is really this diamond in the center of the intersection between imperative costs versus planned value. What you want to do is continue to optimize your ability to generate the highest possible value at the lowest possible cost or effort. And that's that competitive edge there, where you're focused on your most important customers in terms of your organization's competitive advantage and the lowest possible costs, with the least complexity, the lowest level of technical debt, the lowest level of toxicity, the highest level of sustainability. Does that make sense? That's what we're talking about here, is actually how we would actually make the change of creating a culture that would be focused on value, then measuring value and learning from those measurements to continually get better and better at optimizing our delivery capability to generate more value to the organization, and to lead through navigating cost differentiation and value generation. So we're probably all very familiar with the Agile Triangle. We're certainly familiar with the traditional triangle. Does this diagram look familiar? Often most of us spend most of our energy and efforts on metrics that are focused on cost, schedule, scope, budget, resources, velocity, which would be team capacity. In other words, we focus most of our metrics and most of our learning on the constraints. This complements to Jim Highsmith for developing the Agile Triangle here, which focuses our energy on the area that we're talking about, which is value, a releasable product. Putting our metric energy into quantifying and tracking the delivery of value and quality, which is a critical success factor towards value. Quality, Jim often calls future value, and it's not possible to create a sustainable source of value without equally focusing on quality for sustainability, because those trade-off decisions that Rebecca talked a lot of in her session, leading to code complexity or unsustainable architectures result if we shortcut quality by responding to those urgent constraints of budget, cost, schedule, scope, resource contention, or the never-ending demand that we started with talking about today, there's always more new demand than we have capacity to do. So we've got to be able to make those trade-off decisions of understanding where that intersection is to create that diamond. So what Jim's come up with, Jim Highsmith here, is the Agile Triangle, which kind of reminds us that where we usually spend most of our energy on metrics is in the cost, schedule, and scope category, which is constraints. Whereas our teams should be focusing on leveraging or balancing those constraints while we focus really on measuring value with each releasable product to the customer and actually putting in the process to measure that actual value that's delivered or benefits realization against the planned value that we planned to deliver, which was originally justified the project in the first place. Does this make sense? You know, so this is the foundation of sort of shifting our focus from constraint, which is kind of like driving through the rearview mirror when you think about it. How are we doing based on our budget? To actually, how are we doing on that value generation? How are we doing on that value creation focus? Kind of changing our focus to the future as opposed to looking in the rearview mirror in the past. You know, spending a lot of unnecessary energy on tracking constraints as opposed to real value creation, and where that next new product is in terms of generating the highest value. So let's pause for a moment and imagine if everyone on your team, if everyone in your organization shared a razor-like focus, you know, on delivering only the highest value and eliminating the wastes, identifying where there are obvious wastes through value stream mapping in the processes out there, and kind of, you know, building on that delivery cycle engine and tuning that engine in terms of improved efficiencies of process flow. At the same time, they challenged pretty much everything that was existing in the organizational infrastructure that actually generated marginal value or waste. You know, wasteful meetings, wasteful processes, excessive emails. You know, these are typical areas of waste. Excess inventory, all of the 8 lean wastes that are out there. Does this make sense? Imagine if everybody changed their focus to look at opportunities for creating value and maximizing value. You know, some ways to do that might be to actually start tracking the waste that you're eliminating by not going to meetings that you don't actually need to be at. You know, and focus instead on finding innovative ways to work more effectively at generating the most value for an organization. That kind of plants the seeds to flip the paradigm of doing more with less. You know, kind of eliminate that from your organizational kind of conversations and actually come up with challenging ways to do less. If you went back to your teams tomorrow and you challenged them all to actually start doing less, you might be very surprised with what their reactions might be. They're so unaccustomed to being empowered to actually focus on doing less. So that we need to give them, first of all, the tools to know what is creating more value and what is creating less value. And again, we mentioned that we took some of our tools out of this presentation, and Shane's going to be kind of talking us through some tools that he has found to be very helpful in terms of quantifying this. And in the spirit here is creating an organizational culture that is focusing on optimizing the flow of value and nothing more. You know, just like that phrase that's kind of crept up into our organizational vocabulary of doing more with less, you know, we're finding that right now we've eliminated most of the truly obviously wasteful processes in our organization. You know, but there's a lot of processes that actually create what we'll call marginal value, which is the effort actually exceeds the benefit of the value that we create. The cost exceeds the benefit. And the challenge that we're finding ourselves now, and the challenge that we're in right now, is to be able to quantify those marginal value processes and eliminate those to create the space for innovation. We all talk about innovation. We all know innovation is a good thing. It's as much a buzzword as value. but rarely do we find the opportunity to carve out the space to create innovation or for innovation to occur. So the goal here would be to increase the amount of work you don't do, to reinvest the time that it would take to do that work into creating a space for the organization to focus on innovation. And focus on developing the tools within your own organization, within the context of your own organization, to do that. Some of the levers that we're looking at is tools that would allow us to increase throughput, decrease cost or investment for allowing that throughput of value to occur, and obviously decreasing the process costs or the operating expense costs, which are just the costs of doing business, the cost of the team communicating, the cost of the team learning, the cost of the team optimizing. Does this make sense? Creating and managing expectations around empowering everyone to feel as if they could challenge, kind of show me the value questions, to challenge what the true cost is, and design smarter work. Oftentimes it helps to work backwards from what the team needs to actually achieve optimal value, or work backwards from what the customer actually needs versus what the customer expectation is, or the planned features or stories to deliver customer value. Streamlining that path and keeping it as simple as possible is kind of the fastest track to value navigation. So by changing the rules of the game, inviting your teams to ask, show me the value questions, and being able to actually demonstrate that, sets the tone. Looking at providing a line of sight for each of your team members to where the organization has set their priorities for the strategic plan or the organization's vision and mission statements, building a value model based on that, and using that value model to score the stories or the priorities that are out there on your organization's backlog, and then start to put in the infrastructure to test the value that's actually delivered with the planned value. We see that happening all the time with lean startup and the concept of actually experimenting, testing the value. Even Declan's story that he shared a little bit before the break, which is he put the guardrails in place to actually test that design so that he could quickly change or adapt based on the results, versus the plan there. So a simple value framework that I have used at organizations that actually enable us to start building on this would be the process first of assigning value. That generally, the assignment of value, the creation of a value currency, generally happens at the executive level and is administered at the portfolio level, where you take a look at the budget that's assigned for value generation within the organization for a certain period of time, whether it's quarterly or whether it's annually, ideally quarterly, and you look at what the budget is actually, what is the capacity that the organization has to deliver value as measured by the portfolio of projects and the budget. That's then administered by your portfolio management team in larger organizations, pushed closer down in smaller organizations. Then your ability to allocate value at the product owner level, once they have calibrated on what a value story would look like from the value model and how they quantify value, they would then allocate value generally at the capability level, at the release level, because it's the release where you're actually generating value to the customer. So delivering value with each iteration, releasing value with every release, whatever your release cycle is, and then the important part, measuring the value that was actually delivered based on the customer behavior or the customer response based on what was planned, and then going back and incorporating that back into the learning cycle, the value learning cycle. So this is just a simple value framework. Walt can pull up some other models to kind of walk us through, kind of if there are questions about actually engineering this, getting down at a deeper level. We can also share with you the value dials and the value model that came out of the Intel engineers' work that can lay a foundation for you in terms of being able to start to quantify your unique value dials at your organization. So in each level of the value framework, in terms of the organization, the roles in the organization that administer that, generally you'll find that the executives and the product and the portfolio assigns the scope of value. The allocation of value at a story level or at a capability level usually comes from your product owner organization or your product managers. Then the engineers are actually focused on delivering the highest value with the least possible effort in delivering every story that they pick up. Then releasing the value to the customer goes back to the product owner again in terms of calculating actual benefits realization or value that was delivered based on plan. And the portfolio teams also measure, sorry, I think I had a slide in here that I wanted to show you, which were value curves. The portfolio teams actually measure value curves based on value delivered. Sorry, this is such a small slide, but we're all familiar with the either burn up or burn down chart of the team's velocity against planned value release, right? That's this line right here. You know, in a waterfall world, for those of us who may have worked in a waterfall world, the value curve is flat pretty much all the way across the project. And then if a miracle occurs, you know, we hit the planned value, right? Sound familiar? Normally it goes negative, you're right. That goes back to the statistics, Shane. But, you know, yes, question?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense what you're saying, comparing value cost. That's
Yes.
pretty basic
Pretty basic.
thing to understand. I think the hardest thing for us is really how do you get a value point out of anything?
Yes. Excellent
So
question.
do you have some real world examples
Yes.
or something
Yes.
to extract this magical value point out of the error, I guess? I don't know where it comes from. So
Yes.
It's true, right now we don't do it right. We're judging things based on their level of difficulty at the lower level, at the developer level.
Yeah.
What this is trying to do is make value visible from end to end. That's why it's coming in from a very high level to start with, management, and they're establishing those value points or value dials. What's most important to your company? What has value, and how do you calculate it, and how do you talk about it? Everyone has to speak the same lingua franca, no cheating.
Yeah.
Right? So now you've got apples to apples. So you got to be careful when you do this stuff, because the tendency is you get too many darn value dials established. They get out of control. Intel only has 18, the whole company. And you know, it's no small feat to get this stuff implemented. But I think it's a real blocker for Agile, because we want to work on stuff that matters from a business point of view. And what are developers going to do if they have a couple of things that they know what the value is for feature A and feature B, might even be on different projects. Which one are they going to work on? They can see it. This is the one that has the most business value. They're not crazy, right? So now you can do great comparisons. But it takes a lot of discipline to get this in. It took Intel years.
Different teams often have different values too, like a customer
No cheating.
service team.
Yeah.
If you got your value dials in and you talk about the same way, you have to calculate it the same way,
Yeah.
right? So if you have projects, a portfolio that's being proposed, those projects have to be related to at least one value dial. The more, the better. You've got better chances of getting the project approved if it has
In other
more
words,
value.
they're scored against the enterprise value model.
And the cool part is, you can, once you've got it established up there, what this particular project, it's an estimate, everything's an estimate. You know, you can't assume that, you know, I've got value assigned to this project, it's a finite thing. No, it's gonna move and all that. But you wanna drill that down to lower levels, down to the feature level. Now below that, we've got stories. We live in the story area. You still have that. You still have all your story estimates, all that. That belongs to dev, QA, all that. But now you also have a value estimate.
Normalizable across the portfolio, that's the key.
You got two things. Yeah, you've got a level of difficulty and you have a business value.
Yeah.
So it starts, great question on your part, it starts
Yeah,
by
that's
creating
right.
this enterprise value model so you can all align on a big visible chart of this is where the value is. This is a generic enterprise value model. It would look something like this. where you quantify, okay, what is our purpose and what's our profitability levers? And what are we going to focus on this year? Are we going to focus on, and for example, faster time to market, increased revenue generation to create new products, or whatever, opening new markets? This would be kind of what a generic value model might look like. Does that make sense? That's the theoretical model, right? But your question's a really good one. Then where do you actually come up with quantifying value? How do you actually take the leap of defining value? Most people get, yes.
So the previous slide, that's a value model.
That's an enterprise value model, right?
So what does that mean? This is just like essentially a list of things that the company thinks is important to them?
Yeah, exactly.
Are they in order of priority here, or like what is this chart?
This actually gets it out on the wall, gets it out on the table, so that everybody in the organization has a line of sight to what the purpose of the organization is. We just used Facebook here to make the world more open and connected. But generally, once you define, and this is the work that's done with the executive level, and they do this kind of setting up their strategy. Once you define what the value model looks like, you might have, your organization might have very targeted objectives for the year. Move into new global territories, open new markets. You might have a cash challenge in your organization. You might focus on cash creation or profitability this year. So you would start with, these are the things that are important to you. This is what you want to do to create business. But then you would prioritize. You would prioritize here based on, what your priorities are for the year. And this is foundational, creating the foundation. One of the things I'm hoping you would bring up as a question, so we'll just plant the seeds, is what about that elusive quality measure? How do you measure quality versus code coverage quality or code-based quality, sustainable future value against the new business features? That's where the friction usually occurs in terms of competing for the dollars for the technical budget to actually pay down technical debt or focusing on prioritizing refactoring. We're going to go into that with the next slide. But this is where it starts in terms of creating. Possible value dials might be revenue generation, risk avoidance, time to market, code quality improvements, future value, right? Whatever's important to your organization, these value dials will be specific to your organization. Now this slide kind of starts to answer your question. Where is that elusive magic occur? Where you actually quantify value and cost. What we found in the organizations that we work with is the sweet spot of this is in terms of the really ROI, or your value index, is the business value that you create divided by the cost to create it. And that cost would be the effort to create it as well, right? Based on the code, what it costs for an engineer to deliver the code, what it costs for our kind of entire pipeline to actually push that code into production, what it costs to get that value to the consumer, is kind of what happens here. And what we've generally found is organizations are best advised to focus on calculating value at the capability or at the feature level. Oftentimes, depending on the complexity of the product that you're delivering, if you try to push value quantification down to the story level, it's an unnecessary, effort compared to the cost. If you keep cost and value kind of normalized at the capability level or at the slice that you're releasing with a particular release, that's generally what we've found to be the decision-making sweet spot. So let me kind of go right to the heart of your question with the next slide. And that is, how do we actually start to quantify value, right? Because once we can do that, then the rest of this becomes very easy. We can overlay value curves over the cost curves, and we can make those tough value-informed decisions of when to kill a project. So this is an example of how that might work for a given project. Let's just say the planned value of a project is $5 million over the first year of improved customer, return visits or customer purchases or whatever. Let's say we're planning $5 million of profit for that particular project, right? Well, the challenge that organizations get into, and the reason why everyone's not doing this, is because they over-engineer the challenge of how to quantify the true value using the same ratio level estimating technique as you would with dollars. So what we recommend doing is you actually transform $5 million to $5,000 of feature value points. Feature value points. You just kind of scale it down so that it normalizes it into, like, to generate this product and the features of this product that are going to generate the $5 million in new revenue. You know, we've got 5,000 value points. Now we inspire our product owners to actually spread those 5,000 value points against capability A, capability B, and capability C. And they're confident, having done the research and the opportunity assessment and the benefits realization calculations, that they believe capability A is going to generate 25% of that for $5 million. Does this make sense? Right now, you'll notice there's something else that's happening on this chart. In addition to normalizing project A's benefits, planned benefits down to story points, we've kept in reserve some additional story points. This is where you would store technical debt reduction, refactoring, quality story points. And generally, what we recommend is that at an organizational level, you would negotiate, roughly depending on your code quality and roughly depending on your technical debt challenges, you would, let's say 20% of the value points in competing against new business capability or new business features might be reserved for quality, technical debt reduction, for automating code coverage, whatever it is you're refactoring and whatever fits your organizational challenges might be reserved. And those features would be equally scaled against the new business feature capability. So this would be, we're suggesting, is one way that you can do this and one way that simplifies it to the point where now you can get to the point. Does this make sense? Other questions on this? Yes.
Yeah. How about this model, taking into account those must-have features?
Must-have features.
Yeah, say like you have 10 must-have features.
Yes.
And even though each of the value maybe is 5%, but without this feature, you cannot build the product.
Yes.
So you could come with say 95% of the value realized, but if this 5% is not done, you don't have a product.
Absolutely. There's two ways to do that. One is in terms of how this is scaled and you do this iteratively. The other might be if there are, I'm going to interpret your question. There may be some prerequisite features that inherently carry no value, no business value, but they're critical. They're must-have features to actually create the new business value features, right? Maybe is that a proper interpretation? That's where you would then, if there is truly a must-have feature, you know, that does not carry any value points. If the must-have feature, you know, accounts for 90% of the value of the product, that would be handled in this scaling. If there is a feature that is prerequisite to complete the product, but it is actually like carries no business value, then you would make sure that when you are building out this model, just like technical debt reduction or refactoring, you would carry that, you know, that in that category of other prerequisite value points, so that it would no way get lost or compete with the business value features. Does that make sense? In other words, we're not. This is intended to show you how it's done, not that you would divide your capabilities up with this in this particular formatting. Does that make sense? Cool. Other questions? Yes.
So if you're going to compare something like customer experience or technical debt to planned increase in revenue project, how are you going to say this technical debt is going to cost us $1,000?
That's a good question, and that's actually the conversation that doesn't occur often enough, because a lot of organizations, you know, run the risk of technical debt actually never getting addressed with the appropriate level of emphasis that it needs to create the future value. If we go back to Jim's value models, the triangle slide, right? So what that conversation has to occur, Usually it's best occurred at a more executive level between the CTO and the head of product and the head of finance, where it's demonstrated that in order for us to tune the development engine that we have invested in this particular tech stack, we're going to need to secure 20% or 30% or 40% even of the budget for this year, the available capacity budget for this year up front, so that whatever that percentage is gets allocated across the project and never competes with business capability, right? It's the cost of doing business. It's the cost of keeping our engine tuned, our delivery engine tuned, on the tech investment that we've already made, which is our tech stack, right? Does that make sense? In other words, this model enables you or your organization to get away from that sort of tug of war, if you will, of always having to defend a refactoring project or refactoring time against business capability, which happens to be a natural point of friction in most organizations, because you're hard pressed to defend that at the table when all of your business or at the portfolio table, where everybody's competing for the highest value work. But also this solution is sort of self-generating value, because it enables you to track the value curves, and actually kill projects sooner when they've delivered the planned value. Noting that, if you remember back from that value curve chart, most of, true to the spirit and the intent of Agile, most of the value is delivered up front in the project, not at the very end, right? And so where is that kind of curve take place where you can actually make value-informed decision? Okay, if we've delivered 90% of the value in 60% of the cost, because we're getting better and better at this all the time, then you make that value-informed decision to, kill the current project, move the remaining, feature set that's in the backlog to maintenance portfolio, and refocus the team's energy on that next value, higher value project. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So even if you can get everyone in a company or whoever agrees that something like technical debt deserves a certain value number of points, which is a feat in itself.
Yes, it is.
How do you agree on how many value points something like that should be?
Yes.
Because you could have one person that thinks, yeah, technical debt's a problem, but it's only $1,000 problem. And then there could be someone who's like, no, it's $100,000 problem.
Exactly.
How do you even...
It's an assessment of risk. How much risk is there to your organization with your technical debt?
How much risk can you absorb?
Yeah.
And we'll be happy
You
to
can ignore
talk to you at much deeper level of detail, during the breaks or afterwards today on exactly how that conversation needs to unfold. But that is generally better handled not at the portfolio decision level, but at a strategic level, going back to your value dials, right? So if we go back to, at this level, when this conversation is occurring at the executive level, and ideally you have your CTO at the table here, as well as your CIO. Your CTO and your CIO needs to have a very forthright, goes all the way back to the beginning of our presentation, which is face reality. They need to have a very forthright conversation, armed with all the appropriate statistics of what is the risk of not investing 10, 15, 20 or more % of your portfolio budget in your future sustainability of your tech stack, based on what that informed decision would be best done there with the appropriate metrics and materials to actually look at, as Walt said, what is the risk of not maintaining that engine, and not focusing on future value.
I was at a company a few weeks ago in Silicon Valley, Uyala. They actually hit the wall. They couldn't scale, and they pretty much kept trying to operate for a couple of years. And they finally got to a point where they had to bring everything to a screeching halt. They took 6 months out to totally refactor, their business. But that's all operating expense. So they didn't add any real new features or anything. They just couldn't scale it. The risk got too great.
Which
They had to do
happens
something.
too often. But if that conversation takes place at the strategic level, and it actually gets incorporated into your value dials as future value. The same conversation, believe it or not, happens when you're competing with innovation against new feature, revenue generating new feature delivery, right? That same conversation has to occur. We're trying to say, elevate that conversation so that when it gets to the portfolio level and at your team level, you can get to the place where you can actually calculate and make value-informed decisions based on normalized value story points, based on the last chart that we showed you, so that at each story level, if that's the decision that you make in terms of tracking value at the story level, it's simply an allocation of prioritization. If that feature has 100 value points, your product owner would delegate those across the stories on your backlog, to help make those value-informed decisions right at the story prioritization level. And then you can divide, again, the value minus or divided by the cost gives you that normalizable value point. Is this fairly similar to how you're actually using value points in your organization?
The business value is more of it's basically a set of criteria.
Yes.
And that's what kind of gives you a rough idea of what the value is.
And it's scored. That's what Walt was referring to as the value dials.
Yes.
And we'll make available to you, the value dials are the scored criteria that Intel used to actually rank. The other, this formulaic approach allows you to go down at a deeper level and actually normalize across the portfolio. Because that's often the challenge.
Yes, because you have there's a lot of subjectivity to this whole
Yes.
exercise.
Right.
And my high value item is more important than yours.
Exactly, right.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
when the arm wrestling or the tug of war
Absolutely.
begins. But if you were to approach an approach like this, it takes the subjectivity away and actually then applying the rigor of benefits realization or calculating the actual benefits the actual value to the customer based on what you predicted, allows you to learn. That allows you to make, that double loop learning where you can say, how well did we do at delivering that and was it the right thing to deliver? So you can go back and continue to tune your value management processes. So basically this is an approach that we found works really well in terms of taking that, as you call it, magic or that elusive value scoring technique and turning it into a real number that you can really manage. Yes?
In Intel's case, did they have adjust the value dials once a year? Or?
In Intel's case, their value dials were at a higher level, not by product, at the portfolio level, but by how Intel IT delivers value to the Intel organization. So they did not tune it every year, but they continued to perfect it. Intel did a really good job of sort of laying the foundation for this, and they incorporated their finance, their HR and finance folks, in terms of doing some really rigorous testing. They spent 5 years kind of pulling this together. It's a worthwhile model to use as a starting point in terms of looking at how they quantified and scored, value points. And again, you can easily go out there and find it by looking at Intel value dials and Intel value, but we'll also make it available to Philippe to share with you if that's a possibility, Philippe.
Actually, it speeds up the entire financial process.
Yeah,
That good motivation for finance to be involved.
right.
They want to get that kind of language in place. They would establish the dials. So there are a bunch of calculations that really aren't super granular. And you get in trouble when you start getting too granular.
Yeah,
So they kept it up at a higher level, and they just made projects do that. And from the project level on down, you allocate. And then you have to keep reallocating as circumstances warrant, because you may have, must-have features that weren't thought about, and all of a sudden they're in the project, right? And then you reallocate, and all of a sudden that feature bubbled up, and it has more of the value allocation. People can see it. That's the cool part. People can see value. And agility is all about self-organizing teams. This helps that. It's all about visibility. This helps that. If you let those teams see value, they're going to react, and they're going to start making better decisions down there.
and they're going to learn.
Things
The
change.
ultimate
It's a big
unit
change.
of value is learning. Right, and this actually tackles that elusive challenge of really making value visible and showing me the value. Show me the value in a way that's normalized or equalized across the portfolio to make those trade-off decisions. Because executives struggle with this. You know, Rebecca mentioned in her talk, you know, about there is no silver bullet and there is no crystal ball. You know, yet we expect our product owners to make value-informed decisions all the time without actually learning, you know, about what the true value is and what the relative value is, right? So the spirit of this is making that elusive measure, you know, transparent and manageable, and then continuously learning with every release of value to the customer on testing our assumptions. How close were we to our, you know, what we assume the customer would really write? And it ties this right back to the whole lean startup. You know, kind of thin slices, the smallest possible experiment, put it out there and see what the customer does to make informed decisions continuously, right? So we wanted to kind of share with you the challenge is not going to go away. Tomorrow we're going to still have more work to do than we can possibly do. What if you were able to introduce to your organization a tool at its simplest level that would actually start to quantify the value, you know, and then learn from it? Because at the end of the day, our ultimate way to deliver value to the customer, tying it right back to Diana's presentation of, you know, level, the fluency level 1, you know, is the team's focus on value, you know, delivering value to the customer to actually make informed decisions, right? So other questions? Other comments? Yes.
A problematic point, but truthfully, in my own head, tying it to Diana's presentation, this is, to me, interpreting it from Diana's presentation, this is a 4-star focus technique. Because Diana's saying that it's, you know, all, like, sort of everywhere, everybody's aware of the return on investment and
The value?
you know, being aware of the value so that you can, you know, selfishly help out other, you know, competing projects and such. So,
At the developer level, you know, let's kind of ramp that up a little bit. At the portfolio level, that is true. Ultimately, at the portfolio level, they need to make value-based decisions of what project to start and when to wrap up a project. Ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what they're trying to do, just as you would with your investment portfolio, right? You know, if your investment portfolio was failing to deliver what your planned investment strategy was, you would make informed decisions, right, of reinvesting, right? I mean, at the portfolio level, that's kind of what's happening. But I think if I'm understanding your question correctly, you know, at the story level, wouldn't it be useful to your developers to know, you know, how important this feature was? I mean, this story was to developing a mission-critical feature to get to the customer in terms of what your approach might be? Would you know, kind of think about that for a second. Would that be useful information for your developers to know? Not for them to make trade-off decisions of, well, my story is less important than your story, so I'm not going to focus on my commitment to deliver my story because I'm going to focus on, you know, but to have, you know, to at least understand how this story that you're working on ties back to the value delivery chain. You know, the assumption would be that that would be of value to you, or at least to understand how it ties back to a critical capability and how that's measured in terms of delivering value to your customer. You know, that's the assumption. But I'm not sure if I answered your question. Maybe not.
it wasn't really a question.
Okay, it was an observation.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. Good observation, right? And again, we're kind of introducing ideas today that sort of challenge the status quo or conventional wisdom that seems to be, you know, it's too hard to measure value, so we're not going to do it. You know, what Jim Highsmith says is, well, maybe if it's too hard to measure value, we shouldn't be wasting time measuring effort, right? Because they're really not that much harder, you know, at the end of the day, right? And, you know, at least from the concept of really creating your opportunity as an organization to optimize your flow of value to the customer, it does become important to actually start to measure real value and take away this, take as much as you can, eliminate the subjective things. This also addresses the age-old problem of competing, technical refactoring and technical debt reduction from business feature creation, right? There's that age-old conflict. I've seen that occur at every organization I've been in. This gives you the opportunity to elevate that conversation, and actually take care of it in advance in terms of investing, using your portfolio investment dollars to invest in future value or sustainability. So you won't run into that ever-present challenge that Walt was talking about, where organizations hit the wall because they've ignored their technical debt, accumulation too long, and now it becomes almost impossible to fix. Organizations, you want to avoid actually hitting that wall, but how do you actually have that conversation, to quantify the risk of not investing and the tuning of your delivery engine. Think of that, in terms of another way to look at technical debt or toxicity, from Rebecca's talk, buying down that, or, diluting the toxicity in the value chain. Think of it as a value chain. Other questions, other comments, other challenges? Anything? Again, we'll be here throughout the day. We'll be happy to kind of go into deeper level on some of these talks. Declan?
Yeah, you mentioned lean startup a couple of times.
Yes.
And a lot of the other vocabulary that you're using is certainly at an enterprise-y level.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, have you, so I understand that in the spirit of where you use lean startup is meant more about a learning loop,
Yes.
et cetera, right?
Yeah, exactly. Of actually, the parallel here would be to take a thin slice of capability and get it out there and see what the product would offer. I can give you a very specific example if it would be useful. At the Gap, for example, e-commerce clothing company in the United States, the Gap, Banana Republic, there was the expectation that a feature would generate significant value, and that feature was called kind of looking at a very low-level photograph of the product. So it was called swatches, where you're looking at the product. So rather than kind of bet the farm, if you will, or invest in taking the full product line of all of the different brands and putting in the full features of swatch and see what the customers would react to, we would do the thinnest possible slice of one set of men's jeans, for one brand, and put the swatches out there as a test, as quickly, the thinnest possible slice of swatches as quickly as possible, and actually put the test, embed the test at the portfolio level of saying, here's what we think. Let's get it out there in front of the customer and see what their behavior is. And lo and behold, what we discovered was, with that thinnest possible investment of resources and team time and, the whole photography, work and putting it out there, that our assumptions were not quite right, to the extent that the view of the swatch was not sufficient. So we were able to experiment. That was a surprise to the product people, who were absolutely confident that by giving an e-commerce consumer, details about the fabric of the product, it would actually increase sales, right? So in doing that, we discovered we went for the thinnest possible slice, treated it like an experiment. The point I was trying to make with that swatches example is pay attention to those feedback loops in terms of what was planned versus what actually happened. Because if we had not done this and had gone full force, this giant project, it would have had significant consequences. But in turn, what we found out, we didn't then just throw it away either. We said, okay, there's something wrong with our assumptions. We have to learn from those. Let's tune this to get just to the right sweet spot of what the customer really needs to make informed buying decisions online, rather than going to another store down the block and, where they could actually touch the fabric, buy from our e-com store. So that's an example, that was the spirit in which I kind of wove that in. If we weren't paying attention to the benefits realization cycle and actually incorporating A/B testing or, giving this feature to a subset of the consumers based on just a kind of a statistical sampling routine, we wouldn't have learned. And we wouldn't have been able to tune that to the point that we optimized the real benefits realization or the value calculation based on getting it right by experimenting, right? So that was kind of this. Did that answer your question, Declan?
I didn't ask my question yet. That was a great story, though. I really appreciated that.
Thank you.
But the question I had was, do you see value in say, startups or small organizations using a model like this? Because it seems pretty enterprising. And I'm just wondering whether you've seen smaller teams use it and how effective it's been for them.
Great question. And I see value in any organization, taking the time to estimate the value that they expect that feature to deliver and using that, incorporating that in the decision cycle, inherently valuable because it's the mechanism with which we can challenge what's nice to have. Or the example that we talked about all too often, you've probably all found yourself in this scenario. There's way more ideas, and they all sound like good ideas. Whether you're a startup or whether go back to Eric Ries's example to begin with, right? If you're all familiar with Eric Ries's Lean Startup book, the spirit was he found the perfect solution that nobody wanted, right? So, he's, the whole spirit there is test your assumptions with real real consumer response before you put all this energy into building the perfect feature set and finding out that you missed the mark. And so, however small the startup would be, Declan, or however large the enterprise, I think there is value in testing your assumptions with the thinnest possible investment, the lowest possible cost to value, and the shortest possible speed to value loop, to get that test back, validate what they really want, and then continue to tune that. So this model adds no value if you don't have that benefits realization customer feedback A/B testing loop in, but it's priceless no matter whether you're a small startup with one tiny little product or whether you're a giant corporation that's trying to use this to make really tough decisions, value-based trade-off decisions across your entire, billion or more portfolio.
We hear a lot of that from startups. They're on the same boat. They can't really identify what is valuable to the organization. They're building something from scratch. They don't know if it has market value, but hey, this is all an estimate. So what it does, this method does, it allows you to set up a lingua franca, to start talking about value. And then you will start to grow. As you grow, your value, your dials will change or whatever. But trying to back it in later is a lot harder. I think you have a real advantage if you're small and you can start right away. And I know a lot of startups that say, we don't make any move or make any decision without data. Those people are more advanced.
Right.
A lot of them, it's like chaos.
Can you think of an example of using a customer feedback loop to help in decision making for things like technical debt and things that are harder to predict, that would be useful to have some actual data on that kind of thing? But it also seems like that's a much longer term kind of a thing where you're like, if I didn't do it right, we'll know in 2 years when we're completely bankrupt or whatever.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Finance guys
it's a
know that
great
too, because
question.
they have all kinds of depreciation been going on with devices that wear out. Big software just wears out, so it's not used to that. So it's a plus.
The answer would be, well, I think the fastest path to an answer for you would be, you're not asking the end customer, because the end customer can tell you what their expectations are in terms of performance, uptime and speed, throughput, that kind of thing. You know, you're measuring trends over time in terms of how much more compromised or difficult it is to maintain that, and what would the risk of a failure really be. You know, kind of like when Rebecca was sharing her talk, she was saying there are some cases where you wouldn't really want to invest a great deal of effort in technical debt if you're expecting the life of that, you know, code to
Life of
not,
the asset.
the life of the asset to not, you know, to be almost at end of life. You know, but what you'd want to do is actually invest in measuring technical debt and tracking it and looking at trends, you know, to be able to present empirical data about the likelihood of failure and the likelihood of the cost and effort to recover from the failure based on the data. That's an area where I would be looking at what the end consumer or the end customer is telling us in terms of their expectation, you know, in terms of sales and what the dependency is, but I'd trace it back to that value model that the organization has, and I'd say, what is the cost of failure? What is the risk here? And are we willing, and what's the probability of that risk based on the trend data, performance data over time? You know, so I'd be looking more inwardly for that data, not outwardly to the
So
consumer.
what's an example of something that you would track over time that gives an indication of how well you're doing with something like technical debt or not?
Well, that we might want to, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, there are several. Defect counts. As code gets cruftier, it's more difficult to get right. So regression bugs. Cycle time is a big one. So you can monitor, you know, features in this area. In general, we used to be able to turn them around quickly, and now it's taking twice as long,
Right.
and that gets you to your time to market. So I think also not just internal failures, but you know, slowdowns, production issues. You know, those are all quantifiably traceable to, okay, if you've got a piece of code that it's difficult to maintain, it's difficult to enhance, what is the consequence of that? Well, the consequence is you're going to have more bugs, it's going to take longer, you're less likely potentially to catch bugs because they might be more subtle.
It takes more time to catch bugs.
Takes and also takes more time to even develop it in the first place. So those would be the things that you would measure as the indicators of your either success or failure at resolving technical debt.
So that sounds like it would be a useful measurement to see, like if you are in a project and you create technical debt,
Yes.
you'll see a change right
Yes.
away.
Yeah.
But if you are dealing with the question of whether or not to address a very long-standing technical debt,
Yeah.
it's hard to see a change right now because you're already kind of in it.
That's where you look at the trend data.
Yeah,
Okay.
and the improvement.
Right.
Yeah, because that's why it's also important to decide what debt to address. Because if you've got something that's in the component that, the part of your system that your business user keeps wanting to change, you're going to be able to say, okay, if you give me 20%, you know, then I will be able to demonstrate to you that these features are going to come faster. And so yes, it is more of a forward-looking thing, and there's a bit of, they have to give you the benefit of the doubt. The other thing you can do is, okay, if it's already a mess, start tracking those things, and probably they'll continue to get worse because, you know, technical debt, you know, it will continue to deteriorate, and that might be the source of the data that you have to use. But you have to start measuring it somewhere.
And it's possible, you know, I've known some companies will actually, you know, at the point of building the code, at the build stage, they actually do the code analysis to assess if there's any significant increase in technical debt that's coming from the new code based on shortcuts. So you can actually bake that quality in, you know, at the actual branch, before the branch cut level, right? You know, and then the tools are fairly mature to do that. But as Rebecca was kind of talking about, it requires the analytics to look at the trends, you know, and look at how long it's increasingly taking how more fragile your, by not investing appropriately with technical debt reduction, and what are the trade-offs in terms of how critical that particular code is to your value, enterprise value model, right? Is it, if it's on its last leg and it would cost more to fix it than just to absorb the risk of it failing is one thing, then if that's your core vehicle for generating value, would be quite another, right? But that, as Rebecca was saying, or as implying, that conversation takes place ideally at the CTO level, not at the individual developer level, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Just one more comment on that topic before
Sure.
I ask my question, which is that I was working on a project 7 or 8 years ago for a company that makes slot machines, and the developers recommended 2 components that needed to be refactored. One of them was some legacy code that we got about a month, and it was going to cost a lot of money to refactor it, so we just decided to eat the maintenance costs and not touch it.
Yeah.
But the other component, we actually calculated the odds of the bug happening
Cool.
was about 15 million to 1.
Yeah.
But if it happened, it was going to cost the company $2 million-ish.
Yeah.
So we actually decided that no matter how small that risk was,
Yeah.
we couldn't have it there, so we
Right.
fixed it.
Especially if you then add on what is the cost to remediate, and it's significant less than that, you make those value-informed decisions and risk-informed decisions. So thank you for sharing that story. And you had
But my question actually was about if you had, say, 20% of the value points
Yes.
assigned to, say, technical debt
Yes.
for the following year,
Yes.
at the 2-week iteration planning level,
Yes.
how do you ensure that that 20% is making it into the iteration, that your product owner isn't just always favoring the other categories? Or do you have some advice on how that would work at that level?
Yes, great question. First of all, this is a fluid process. This is a fluid process. In other words, it shouldn't be done once, and I pulled back this slide. It shouldn't be done once at the beginning of the project and then never looked at again. You should have those, that double loop learning happening with each release, and validate. Do you need to, so let's just pretend that this bucket is this 250, well, that says customer experience, but let's just say this other bucket was what the technical debt reduction refactoring bucket is. You would make decisions, do we need to move from this bucket or that bucket, or do we need to pull from the portfolio to increase this based on the pattern of data that's emerging with that newest release, right? So, but never should we ever compromise these sacrosanct or preserved technical debt bucket in competition with a new feature. That's again the decision that has to happen at a more elevated executive level, that we commit as an executive team. This 20% of the portfolio is going towards technical whatever. It could be technical debt reduction, it could be automated whatever, it could be a brand new platform, whatever, but that's never competing with the business. That's the whole spirit of this particular chart, is to say that once that conversation occurs, you've got that preserved for the year, the budget cycle, but then should work in quarterly review process to see if you need more. But you should never be in a situation of giving it back to the business, because they've got another really bright idea out there that supersedes our technical debt reduction or our, and again, think of technical debt reduction or any technical, tuning the engine as future value, right? If you phrase it in the terms of future value, a business generally understands that that's the cost of doing business. We built this amazing engine of delivery, this delivery engine. We need to keep it tuned, right? It doesn't just run on its own. So great questions. Anything else? Yes.
How is the feature points to value points exchange rate decided?
You're saying feature points to value points?
Yes, there is an exchange rate, right? There should be an exchange rate.
Yes, good question. It's whatever your organizational currency is in terms of value. the exchange rate is based on this exchange rate formula that you come up with at the portfolio. So let's say in this particular example, we're saying that, this is the simplest example, that we're expecting this feature to deliver $5 million of value. So the exchange rate is, that translates to 5,000 value points. But we're using profitability here as the base of the currency. You know, we do this at organizations that, nonprofit organizations that are not actually driven by profitability. We were doing it for a university that was actually driven by knowledge creation. So your base there would be having the exchange rate based on knowledge creation. You know, and that there is no magic or silver bullet between the 5 million and the 5,000. It's just the reason why we recommend having the exchange rate is because if we left that at 5 million, oftentimes people fall into the trap of trying to over-engineer absolute value points. And the spirit of value points is that they should be relative to the point of being valuable, right? And not overly precise so that this isn't exactly, you know, down to the 15th decimal point precision.
I was thinking more about the exchange rate between value points and feature points, because, okay, somehow we end up with 5,000 value points, right?
Yes.
At the same time, the backlog might be of, I don't know, 10,000 feature points. The thing is that what the exchange rate ratio between value points and feature points,
Yeah.
that's 1-to-1. We have 5,000 value points, that means that we have 5,000 feature points.
You're exactly right. And when you're saying, you're probably talking about story points, right? Which are
that's what you said, the feature points.
here? No, this would be a cost point. A cost point, which would be, what's the level of effort to complete that work?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It's feature points are the calculation of cost. That's what I think. You know? In the end, you estimate the cost of a feature in whatever feature points.
Oh, okay, got it. Sorry, story points, feature points, whatever you call that, right? The level of effort to actually create that story,
Yeah.
right? And they don't need to be on the same scale,
Yeah. So
right? In fact, it would be confusing if you tried to make them be on the same scale.
right. So what's the exchange rate between them?
It would be relative to however
There is no
your
exchange.
organization. There is nothing. There is no relationship between the two. The point is when
Trying
they're
to do
both
so will destroy you.
standardized. Yeah, totally. If they're both standardized, you can still do basic math with them. Does that make sense? You could still take, you know, as long as your value points are normalized, which means you use the same conversion rate for calculating your value points, then you can normalize them across your portfolio. But there's no intention to create a currency conversion rate between story points, cost points, or value points, right? The point is that you measure them each.
However,
Because
the
you can
ratio
manage
between
what
the
you
two
measure.
numbers, pardon me, the ratio between the two numbers could give you an ROI that is comparable between features.
Exactly, right. You said it better than I did, right? I was trying to articulate
Okay.
that. Right, thank you. I hope that makes sense. But if not, you can talk with us during break. We welcome talking during break. You're welcome to contact us. We'll be happy to share with you the Intel work, the Intel value dials, and a lot of deeper dives on this. And then Shane will actually walk us through in his presentation some additional tools that will help make value visible. Do we want to do any other questions, or do we want to do a break, Susan, or go right in?
Well, as long as you speakers are okay, we actually had allowed an hour at the end for discussions, which
Yes.
seems to be happening all the way through.
Cool.
So, as long as you guys really want to organize it, as long as we're done by around 5:15 or so,
Cool, you're good
we're
with it.
good. 5:15, 5:30.
Thank you.
So if you want to take a short break now,
Philippe, did you have any questions?
No, I just want to bring a slightly different approach there.
Yes.
With some colleagues, first we decided to not use the word points on the
Yes.
value side, and it's really stay away, so we call them UT.
Perfect.
for
Change
some
the language, right?
For some strange reasons.
Yes.
So we have utils and points.
Value
So
units
because very
and
often
feature.
people suddenly get
Right.
confused. Oh, now you have two kinds of points, and what's the
Yeah, yeah.
conversion rate between the two? Do
Perfect.
I multiply 1 by 1.7 to get no?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
utils and there's points.
Great.
And for the utils, you started on the previous slide. You started from some expected monetary value for
Yes.
the business. Very often, this gets, especially young organizations, actually, in a total rat hole, and we never get out of that. So we take one feature and we say, this one is 100 UT. Do we all understand what it is?
Yep.
And now we take all the other one and we just compare it. Oh, compare with
Yes.
our standard, you know,
Yeah, like
100
t-shirt
this
sizing,
is a 120, and
right.
this is a 20, and this is a 10, and this is a 2, and
Right.
this, oh, this brand new one, this is a 600.
Excellent.
So it's all relative.
Excellent.
Pretty much what we do with story points, which
Yeah.
are pretty much
Excellent.
based on nothing.
Then you don't waste any time on false precision, and you recognize it's just a guess until you get that.
It's an estimate.
Yes. Excellent.
And there's the same effect of drift after a while.
Right,
You know,
right.
every
And
time
learning.
the product manager comes with a new idea and they say, oh, this is a 600. You know, but
Yeah.
okay, we need to sort of say, really, when we compare to the 100,
Yeah.
really a 600, it's not like a 110.
Yeah.
But completely separating it from any dollar value.
Yes.
But we can still do with the utils net present value, that is look at the discount over time. If
Yes.
we defer that by 6 months, if
Right.
we defer that with a relatively significant discount, sort of like 20%, not
Right.
2 or 3% because it becomes in the noise.
This method kind of helps because it helps level the value assignments to projects because they're visible across the entire organization so they can be disputed. And it's harder to game the system if you have discipline in rolling up all of these things. So I think it has some value there as well.
And your solution as well is lighter weight, you know, with a relative value against, we call that like t-shirt sizing, you know, but it works really well. The spirit is that you do something. The spirit is that you do something and learn from it and do something and learn from it. And the spirit is you don't use the waste of over-engineering. As Philippe said, some organizations could go down a rat hole if they try to get a false level of precision, which often happens. So that's another solution that Philippe was talking about, just relative estimating. You would take the next feature and you'd say, well, compared to this one, you know, how does that compare? Higher, lower, you know, and whatever works with your organization, the spirit would be that you actually put the effort in, the discipline, as Walt says, to actually start to measure value and learn continuously from it. Other comments, Philippe?
What is a function point?
You probably don't want to go there. Function points, that will be a conversation for, is probably a wasteful measure that we probably don't want to go into, right? But there are organizations that use Moscow, must have, should have, could have. And some organizations had gone through a lot of energy to quantify the function points in the code that are going to be delivered. Not one that we recommend you do.
So actually, unadjusted function points are more on the value side.
Yes.
And when you do the adjustment, you actually take into account some kind of conversion based on the difficulty that it is to implement something.
Right.
So this is variable conversion rate between value and cost.
Yes.
Because it has to take into account the capacity of the organization, the
Exactly.
difficulty of doing it, and all this kind of stuff.
Exactly. Good point that Philippe is making in terms of the cost. When your teams are estimating the cost of the effort, they should incorporate the complexity of the cost as well as the, you know, the time that it takes to do it. Incorporate that complexity factor because otherwise it will inevitably surprise you. But, and also continue to tune that based on your heuristics. Thank you. Anything else before we take a break? Yes, sorry.
Well, this isn't totally formalized in my head, but it struck me that when you're assigning the high-level value, if there's a couple of competing directions that the company could go, the industry might go this way or it might go that way.
Yes.
So we should maybe have projects, a project that goes this way and a project that goes that way. They both probably won't, come to fruition, in the industry, but we have to go both ways, because if we don't do either, it'll, put us in a very
It'd be
bad
equally
state.
bad.
But if the complexity of doing one project is easy and the complexity of doing the other project is very hard or costly,
How do you resolve it?
At an executive level, you might just go 50% of the value here, 50% of the value for doing that project. But then it's over allocating priority, which would have a tendency to develop into giving people budgets for both projects.
Yes, and there are always trade-off decisions that have to be made. But remember the swatches story that I was talking about earlier. You're trying to get the thinnest possible slice to test your assumptions before you disrupt your whole portfolio by making kind of bold, radical moves. That actually brings us back to the enterprise value models, and when these are prioritized or force-ranked ordered, if you will, in terms of percentage of value, then the executives need to make those trade-off decisions, but we need to provide them with as much empirical data as possible about what we expect the value to be and how we're going to measure it and how we're going to thin slice it as thin as possible to actually come back with better informed decisions. But ultimately, the president or whoever leads your organization has the option to assign sufficient funding for those really tough decisions that have to be made. But the teams should never have to struggle with it at that level, but provide that, the level of effort and cost and complexity, and I hope that helps. But we'll be happy to talk more at the break if you'd like to. Great. Well, thank you very much for your great questions and for your attention.